The night did not begin with violence. It began with applause, the kind that rolled like warm thunder across a packed room and made even hardened men forget themselves for a moment. The chandelier above the stage at the Sands trembled softly, as if it too were listening, and Dean Martin stood just off to the side of the curtain, nursing a glass. He barely touched, watching Frank Sinatra finish a song that had already become part of America's bloodstream. The crowd leaned forward, smiling, some laughing, some with tears. They did not bother to wipe away, and for a few brief minutes the world felt orderly again, like music could still set things straight. It was not lost on Dean that this feeling was fragile. He had learned that lesson young, and relearned it often the night before still echoed in his mind. The quiet insult in a back room, the man who had spoken too loudly about owning the place, and the people in it. The way power sometimes mistook noise for authority. Dean had smoothed that situation with nothing more than a calm look and a polite sentence, but something in his bones told him this night would not be as simple. Some nights carry a weight before anything happens, and this was one of them. The man in question had arrived late, which was always a sign. He did not clap with the rest of the room. He let others part for him. Instead, his suit was expensive, his smile thin, and his eyes restless, scanning not for beauty, but for leverage. He had brought his own gravity with him, the kind that bent conversations and made waiters stiffen. He sat close to the stage, not because he loved the music, but because he wanted to be seen owning the moment, and Dean watched him with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime reading rooms and men. Frank reached the end of the song, and the applause swelled again. He bowed slightly, playful, generous, and human. And then it happened. The man rose unsteadily, not drunk exactly, but unmoored by entitlement. He shouted something sharp and ugly, a remark meant to cut, not to be clever. It landed wrong, and the room felt it like a needle under the skin. Frank paused, still smiling at first, because that was his instinct, to smooth, to charm, to deflect. But the man was not done. He climbed the steps to the edge of the stage, his voice louder now, laced with something cruel, something that did not belong in music or anywhere else. Dean did not move, yet he did not rush, because rushing gives power to the wrong thing. He watched Frank turn fully toward the man, his smile fading into something more guarded. And that was when the punch came, sudden, ugly, unnecessary, a crack that split the night and stole the air from the room. Frank staggered, more surprised than hurt. His hand flying to his face, the microphone screeched and fell. The music stopped, as if someone had cut the wire to joy itself. For a second no one breathed. The injustice was so blatant. It stunned even those who thought they had seen everything. This was not a fight. This was humiliation, an abuse of space and power. A man mistaking his fear for strength. The guards hesitated, unsure of which rules applied, when money and menace shared a face. And that hesitation was the most dangerous moment of all. Dean Martin stepped forward, not fast, not slow, but with the exact timing of a man who understood rhythm better than most. He did not shout, he did not curse, he did not threaten. He simply walked onto the stage, and the room changed, because authority often does not announce itself. It arrives and waits to be noticed. He helped Frank steady himself, his hand gentle, his voice low and private for a moment that belonged only to them. Then he turned to face the man who had thrown the punch. Dean's face held no anger, and that unsettled people more than anger ever could. He looked at the man the way a father looks at a child who has crossed a line, not furious, just disappointed. And when he spoke, it was calm enough that everyone had to lean in to hear, which meant everyone heard. "This is a place for songs," he said, not for your worst thoughts. If you cannot tell the difference, you should not be here." The words were simple, almost soft, but they landed with the weight of judgment, not condemnation, but clarity, the kind that strips a man of excuses. The room held its breath. The mob boss laughed, once sharp and defensive, and opened his mouth to say more, but Dean raised one finger, not as a threat, but as punctuation, and the man stopped, because even he could feel it, the shift, the sudden understanding that the room was no longer his. Dean turned slightly, addressing the audience, now not to rally them, but to restore them. "We are going to take a short pause," he said gently, "because sometimes dignity needs a moment to catch up with shock. Please stay seated." There was no argument in his tone, and no one argued. The guards finally moved, guided less by orders than by the unmistakable sense of what was right. The man protested, blustered, tried to pull rank, but the crowd had changed sides without making a sound, and that silence followed him as he was escorted away, a silence far louder than boos would have been. Frank stood beside Dean, his cheek already swelling, his eyes bright with something like gratitude mixed with pain and pride. Dean put an arm around his shoulders, casual and steady the way he had 1,000 times before, and leaned into the microphone. Once more his voice warm again, almost amused. "Frank is going to take a minute," he said with a small smile, "and then he is going to finish that song, because no one gets to take music away from this room." The applause returned, slower at first, then stronger than before, not wild, not frenzied, but deep and sustained, the kind that rises from the chest. Frank nodded, wiped his face, and stepped back into the light. When he sang again, it was different, rawer, the notes carrying the truth of what had just happened and what had been prevented from happening next. Backstage later, the room was quiet in the way that follows a storm. Frank sat with ice pressed to his cheek, the adrenaline wearing off. Dean poured 2 drinks and handed one over. Frank took it with a shaky laugh. "You always know when to walk in," he said. Dean shrugged slightly. "It is just timing," he replied, "and caring about the right things." What he did not say was that he understood power better than most, not the kind that throws punches, but the kind that stops them, not the kind that humiliates, but the kind that restores dignity without asking for thanks. Dean Martin had learned long ago that justice did not need to be loud, it needed to be clear. And that night in Las Vegas, a lesson was delivered without a single blow returned. The story would travel as stories do, growing and changing in the telling, but the truth remained simple. A man abused his power, and another man took it away with words and presence alone. The next time Frank took the stage, he did so knowing someone had his back, not because of fear, but because of respect. And for the audience who witnessed it, the memory lingered, not of the punch, but of what followed: the calm voice, the steady hand, the way silence itself seemed to choose a side. And that was Dean Martin's gift, not just to his friend, but to anyone who believed dignity was worth defending, that you could shut down cruelty without becoming it, that sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is stand, still speak softly, and remind the world what kind of place it is supposed to be. The weeks that followed carried a strange quiet, as if the city itself was listening. Las Vegas had a way of pretending it forgot things quickly, but some moments sank deeper than the lights and the laughter, and this was one of them. Dean Martin felt it when he walked into rooms where conversations dipped not in fear, but in respect. People had seen something they were not used to seeing: restraint, where retaliation was expected, dignity where chaos usually won, and that kind of memory does not fade easily. Frank healed on the surface quickly. He always did the swelling, went down the jokes, returned the voice, never left him. But something inside shifted, not broken, just more awake. He and Dean spent long nights talking in low voices away from stages and spotlights, speaking about lines that should never be crossed, and the dangerous illusion that power could buy silence. Dean listened more than he spoke, because he understood that real leadership was not about giving speeches, it was about being present when the ground felt unsteady. What no one said out loud was that the man who had been escorted out still existed, still carried influence, still believed the night had been stolen from him. Men like that rarely let go of humiliation. They polish it into grievance and wait for a chance to use it. Dean knew this not from rumor, but from experience. He had grown up watching how quiet resentments turned sharp when ignored. And he also knew that violence was never the answer, because it multiplies what it touches instead. He prepared in the only way that mattered, by being unshakably himself. The opportunity came disguised as an invitation, a charity gala held in a ballroom dressed in velvet and crystal, the kind of event that pretended to be about generosity. While quietly negotiating power behind polite smiles, Frank was hesitant at first. He had every right to be. Dean read that hesitation and placed a hand on his shoulder light. But grounding we go, because we do not hide, he said simply, and that settled it. The night of the gala unfolded slowly, music drifting like perfume, laughter practiced, and brittle Dean arrived composed in a dark suit that did not announce wealth or threat, it announced taste and confidence. He moved through the room, greeting people by name, remembering small details, asking after families, listening more than speaking. And with every quiet exchange, he reclaimed the space without ever demanding it. Then Dean saw him across the room, the same man, older somehow, not in years, but in posture, the confidence slightly bent by memory. Their eyes met, and the moment stretched, not hostile, not warm, just honest recognition of unfinished business. The man approached eventually, because avoidance would have been an admission, and he was not ready for that. "You embarrass me," he said, low enough to sound civil, but sharp enough to cut. Dean did not flinch. He met the gaze evenly and replied without heat, "I stopped you from embarrassing yourself. Those are different things." The words landed, and this time there was no crowd, no stage, no easy villain to play. The man's jaw tightened. He glanced around, expecting support. Finding none, the room had shifted. Since that night, people had choices now, and they had watched which ones mattered. "You think you won," he said. Dean shook his head gently. "This was never about winning, it was about reminding you that some places have rules even for men like us." There it was, the turning point, not dramatic, not loud, just undeniable. The man exhaled the fight, leaving him, because there was nowhere for it to go. He nodded once, stiff, and walked away, diminished, not destroyed. And that distinction mattered. Dean watched him disappear into the crowd, feeling no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction that something had been set right without blood or spectacle. Later that evening, Frank took the stage unannounced, no band, no introduction, just a man and a microphone. He looked out at the room, then at Dean standing near the back, glass in hand, calm. As ever, Frank spoke only one sentence before singing. "This song is for the people who stand up without standing over you." The silence before the first note was profound, then the music carried everything that words could not: gratitude, justice, and the understanding that dignity once restored has a way of protecting itself. Dean listened, head slightly bowed, not seeking recognition, knowing that the greatest victories are the ones that leave no scars behind. The season turned quietly the way it always does in cities built on illusion. One week, the desert air still held heat, and the next it carried a faint chill that slipped through open doors and reminded people that nothing stays suspended forever. Dean Martin felt that shift more than most, because he had learned to read atmospheres the way other men read ledgers, and he sensed that the calm which followed the gala was not an ending, but an intermission when power feels embarrassed. It either retreats or recalibrates, and he knew which direction this story preferred. Offers began to arrive, invitations framed as opportunities, favors disguised as apologies. Dean declined them all politely, consistently, without explanation, because explanations invite arguments, and Dean had no interest in debates that went nowhere. Frank noticed, of course. He always did. One night, after a show, they sat alone in a quiet booth, the room empty, except for the low hum of lights, and Frank finally said it, "You know they are trying to get to you." Dean smiled, faintly swirling the ice in his glass. "They always do," he replied. "The trick is not letting them think they have succeeded." The real threat did not come from fists or shouting. It came from whispers. Suddenly venues hesitated, sponsors asked questions, contracts moved slower than they should have. It was subtle enough to deny and deliberate enough to feel personal. Someone wanted to remind them that silence could still be bought, and that standing up carried a price. This was the deeper injustice, not a single act of cruelty, but a system that punished dignity, quietly hoping no one would notice. Dean noticed. Instead of pushing back publicly, he leaned into patience. He made his appearances smaller, more deliberate. He sang in rooms that mattered less to money and more to people benefit, shows, union halls, private gatherings, where the audience listened with their whole bodies, and not just their wallets. Every time he stepped onto a stage like that, he reinforced something simple, that art did not belong to power. Power belonged to those who showed restraint and care. Frank worried more than he let on. Dean could hear it in the jokes that landed a half-second too late, and the songs he chose which leaned heavier on loneliness than usual. One night, Frank finally snapped in frustration. "Why are we letting them squeeze us?" he asked, pacing the room. "Because fighting them would give them what they want," Dean said evenly. "They want noise, fear, spectacle. We give them consistency." The breaking point arrived not with a threat, but with a cancellation, a major night pulled without reason, an excuse so thin it insulted everyone involved. Frank took it hard, because music is not just work, it is identity. Dean listened to him vent without interruption, then said quietly, "They are testing whether we will bend or break." "And what if we do neither?" Frank asked. "Then we change the room," Dean answered. He picked up the phone and made a single call, not to a boss or a fixer, but to a promoter known for one thing: integrity. The idea was simple, almost old-fashioned: a show open to everyone, affordable, honest, no back rooms, no hierarchy, just music and shared space. It was a risk, because risks always are, but it was also clean, and that mattered. The night of the show, the venue filled slowly at first. Then all at once people came, not because they were invited, but because they heard about it by word of mouth, because something about the idea felt like relief. Dean watched from the wings as Frank stepped out, and the applause that followed was not polished. It was real, unfiltered gratitude. Midway through the set, Frank paused, looked out into the crowd, and told the story, not naming names, not dramatizing, just stating what had happened, and why it mattered. The room listened, silent and attentive, because they recognized truth when it stood in front of them. And when Frank finished, he gestured toward Dean and said, "Some men protect themselves with power, some protect others with calm." Dean did not wave, he did not bow, he simply nodded. Once, because the moment was not about him. It was about restoring balance, reminding people that injustice loses its grip when it is exposed to quiet, steady light. The fallout was immediate and irreversible. The whispers lost their force because they had been dragged into daylight. Sponsors returned, venues reopened, but on different terms, ones that no longer felt like leverage and more like partnership. The men who had tried to squeeze discovered too late that control works only when everyone agrees to pretend. The aftermath carried a strange brightness, as if the city had been washed clean by something invisible. Dean Martin felt it in small ways, the way people met his eyes longer, the way conversations no longer bent around unnamed fears, but moved straight to what mattered. Yet he also understood that when light appears, shadows reorganize, they do not vanish. And part four of this story lived in that tension between relief and reckoning. A new figure entered quietly, not loud enough to be noticed at first, a corporate investor, tied to multiple venues, a man whose power wore a polite face, and whose cruelty arrived wrapped in contracts. Instead of fists, he spoke the language of civility, but practiced exclusion. Behind closed doors, performers, who did not fit his idea of acceptability, found themselves politely sidelined, particularly musicians of color whose talent threatened the narrow order. He preferred it was not shouted, it was documented, sanitized, and therefore harder to confront. And that was the injustice Dean recognized as the most dangerous of all. Frank noticed it too. He heard it in the stories told softly after shows, in the way younger singers hesitated before speaking their names out loud. One evening, a gifted jazz pianist confided that he had been removed from a bill without explanation, replaced, quietly erased. Dean listened without comment, but his eyes darkened, not with anger, but with resolve, because he had seen this pattern before, a cleaner cruelty, one that relied on silence and paperwork to do its work. Dean understood that confronting this kind of power required precision, not volume. He did not call press conferences or make accusations. Instead, he accepted an invitation to perform at a high-profile industry dinner hosted by the same investor, a room designed to display control through elegance, the tables arranged perfectly, the guests chosen carefully, the air thick with unspoken rules. Dean arrived, as he always did, composed, gracious, unassuming, and that unsettled the room more than defiance would have. During dinner, speeches were made praising progress, unity, and culture, words that sounded good and meant little. Dean listened, politely applauded when appropriate, and waited, because patience is a form of strategy. When the time came for him to speak, he rose slowly, no notes, no agenda, just a glass raised lightly in his hand. The room leaned in, expecting charm, expecting nostalgia. Instead, Dean spoke of music. He spoke of the first time he heard a voice unlike his own, and how it taught him something he could not learn alone. He spoke of stages as shared ground, and of the lie that refinement required exclusion. His voice never sharpened, never accused, but the message was unmistakable. Art does not belong to gatekeepers, it belongs to those who bring truth with them. He paused then and looked directly at the investor, Not hostile, not pleading, just present. There are rooms, he said softly, where silence is mistaken for agreement tonight. Does not need to be one of them. The room froze not in fear, but in recognition. People shifted, realizing they were being invited, not commanded, invited to choose what kind of industry they were building. The investor smiled, thinly attempted to deflect with humor, but it fell flat because the spell had broken. The truth had been spoken without insult and could not be unheard. In the days that followed, contracts changed quietly, names returned to bills, opportunities reopened without announcements. No apologies were issued because none were required. Correction had occurred, and that was enough. The pianist played again, this time to a full house, and when he thanked Dean afterward, Dean simply replied, "You earned the room. I just reminded them to open the door." By the time winter settled over the city, the story had grown heavier, not louder, but deeper, the kind of weight that comes when people realize something has truly changed. Dean Martin felt it, in the absence of resistance more than its presence. The threats had stopped, the whispers dried up, and yet he knew better than to mistake quiet for surrender. Power rarely disappears, it waits. And what waited now was something more personal, more dangerous, because it hid behind sentiment. The invitation arrived, handwritten, tasteful, respectful. It requested Dean's presence at a private gathering honoring the legacy of American entertainment, a room filled with legends, patrons, and historians, men who spoke about culture as if it were something they owned. Dean hesitated, not out of fear, but instinct, because this kind of room often wanted a symbol more than a voice. Frank noticed the pause and said carefully, "Sometimes they want you to stand there so they can tell themselves nothing has changed." That was exactly why Dean went. The gathering took place in an old theatre, restored to perfection, the walls lined with photographs of great men, smiling, frozen. In time, the air smelled of polish and memory. Dean walked past the images, recognizing faces, some admired, some complicated, and he understood the subtle message being offered: tradition, permanence, hierarchy. The speeches began praising the golden age, celebrating unity, while quietly rewriting who had been allowed to belong. Dean listened as names were spoken, and others carefully avoided contributions, softened achievements, generalized, until the sharp edges of truth disappeared. It was polite injustice wrapped in nostalgia, and it asked for nothing more than nodding approval. Then came the moment meant for Dean, a request framed as honor. He was invited to speak about the era, what it stood for, what it meant to him. The room expected reassurance, confirmation that the past had been glorious and complete. Dean stood slowly, feeling the weight of expectation and the cost of disappointing it. He began gently, speaking of gratitude, of opportunity, of music that carried him beyond where he started. Then his tone shifted, not dramatically, but decisively. He spoke of voices left out of photographs, talent praised privately, but denied publicly, stages shared in secret and guarded in daylight. He did not accuse, he acknowledged, because acknowledgement is harder to argue with than anger. History is not fragile, Dean said quietly. It does not break when we tell it honestly. It breaks when we pretend it was smaller than it was. The room stiffened, not hostile, but uncertain. Because certainty had been challenged, the organizers shifted in their seats, realizing this was not the speech they had planned, but it was the one they needed. Dean continued, speaking of friendship, of standing beside men like Frank, when dignity was tested, of choosing silence or speech, and how that choice defines a legacy more than any headline. When he finished, There was no immediate applause, just stillness, the kind that signals something important has landed. Then slowly people began to clap, not everyone, but enough, and that was all that mattered, because change never requires unanimity, only momentum. Afterward, a young singer approached Dean backstage, eyes bright, voice unsteady, and thanked him for saying what no one else would. Dean smiled kindly and replied, "You will say it better than I ever could when your time comes." The final movement of the story unfolded without announcement. The way the most meaningful endings often do there was no single night, no stage, no confrontation waiting to be remembered. Instead, there was a gradual settling, as if the world had exhaled after holding its breath too long. Dean Martin felt it most clearly the first evening he walked into a club and realized nothing tightened. People smiled freely, musicians played without glancing toward doors, and laughter rose without calculation. It was not victory, it was balance restored. Frank stood on stage, that night older, wiser, still carrying the echo of every room he had ever sung into his voice. Steady, strong, and unafraid, Dean watched from the shadows, where he preferred to stand, understanding that this was always where he belonged, close enough to protect, far enough not to overshadow. Frank sang, as if the weight had lifted, not because the past was erased, but because it had been faced and survived. And when the final note faded, the applause was not thunderous, it was grateful, and gratitude lasts longer than noise. Later, alone together, Dean and Frank shared a quiet drink. No jokes, no stories, just companionship forged by shared trials. Frank finally said what had been waiting between them. "You never tried to be the hero." Dean looked at him calmly and replied, "Heroes need applause. I just wanted things to be right." Outside, the city continued glowing, promising illusions to those who needed them. But something fundamental had shifted. Rooms remembered choices, words spoken softly, lines drawn without violence, and people carried those memories forward into new spaces. Dean Martin had not changed the world, but he had changed the rules in the rooms that mattered. He had shown that dignity could interrupt cruelty, that calm could dismantle power, and that justice did not require fists, only courage and timing. The story closed not with an ending, but with a continuation. Musicians found stages, doors opened where they had been closed. Silence no longer served wrongdoing, and men who mistook control for strength learned something quieter, more lasting. Dean Martin walked away from the spotlight, as he always had, leaving behind something better than applause, a standard. And years later, when people spoke of that era of lights and shadows, they did not only remember the songs, they remembered the moments when someone stood still, spoke clearly, and reminded everyone what kind of place the world could be if enough people refused to look away.